Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, especially classroom teachers who hold the future in your hands and students who are the future. I'm glad to have been invited today. This is my first trip to Bhutan. My knowledge of Bhutan is very new and very shallow. So I will talk about a larger pattern I've been interested in for 40 years, a pattern whereby folk consciousness leads to nationalism, one of the strongest forces in the modern world. As a historian, I see the story of the world in the past 500 years as very simple. The first half is Europeans and Europeanized countries with new sorts of power explore and dominate most of the world. And the second half of the story is the rest of the world fights back, partly by borrowing some of those same tools. And I think stronger than European technology are European kinds of social mobilization, in particular nationalism. You get the first dose of this in the Enlightenment of the 1700s. You get Rousseau's General Will, where he's trying to figure out how men and women can live together with no kings, no official churches, no aristocrats, and still have a coherent society to the height or depth of the French Revolution, depending on your point of view. You get a political nationalism that's fairly strong. It comes out of the Enlightenment, where rationalism and individualism are the chief sort of goals. But then comes the Romantic Age in Europe, about 1800 to 1850, hard on the heels of the Enlightenment. And it, in many ways, is a reaction to the Enlightenment and creates a much stronger nationalism called cultural nationalism. It starts first with, I think, more than anyone, Herder, Johann Gottfried von Herder, ennobled late in life. He lived from 1744 until 1803. And he argued that every group that has a language, every group that has lived together long enough to have a language, is a folk, a German word, capital V-O-L-K. No matter whether large or small, a folk is valuable if it adds to what he called humanity, what an anthropologist would call probably culture. So the world for Herder was like a stained glass window. It might be something as massive as Chinese Empire, some great panel of color. It might be a very small Iroquois nation, but everyone added their color to the great mosaic of humanity. He thought, and this is, I think, the real beginning of the Romantic Age, he thought that every folk group originated when a certain people came into a certain land and magic happened between them. And for this reason, primitive is not a bad word for him. It's a positive word. It means closer to that original beginning of things for him. And the key word then for the Romantic Age, in contrast to the Enlightenment, the Romantic Age worships history almost to the point of historicism, because it was right. But the key word for Herder and the whole Romantic Age was organic. A folk group, he borrows this word from biology, a folk group grows like a plant grows, true to a pattern in the seed. And the truer the folk group remains to that seed, the stronger it will be in its day. The more it diverges from that pattern in the seed, the weaker it will be. He writes in a divided Germany, dominated by France, told by the French, you have no culture, we French come from the Romans, you Germans come from the barbarians, what can you expect? And so he argues this way: if you took a 3-inch tree of one kind, an oak, and you cut it off at the proper angle and cut a pine tree top on, and tried to graft a pine tree top to an oak, if you use the most careful hormones and plant treatment, it's probably not going to live, and if it does, it's not going to look like much. Why would you cut off German culture in 1789 and tried to transpose a French top. This is the argument of the Romantic Age. The most famous names in folktale scholarship, in terms of collection of storytellers, at least in the West and probably not unknown in the East, are the Brothers Grimm, Jacob and Willem Grimm. They were born in 1785 and 86. Closest of brothers, closer than twins I have known. And their collection of Grimm's fairy tales. Fairy tales is a mistranslation, and it's the English version of children and household tales. But they are a part, an important part of this whole Romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. They were connected to Herder by their major professor, a law prof named Van Savigny, and he was trying to find out the organic development of the law. He was their law professor. He said, and this is from an 1814 book, but this organic connection of law with the being and character of the people is also manifested in the progress of the times, and may be compared with language. For law, as with language, there's no moment of absolute cessation. It is subject to the same movement and development as every popular tendency, and this development, anyway, law grows with the strength and strengthens with the strength of the people and dies away as the nation loses its nationality. It was in his personal library that the Grimms first studied the original sources of the Middle Ages, the legends and the sagas and the songs from the many singers and the troubadours. In 1805, Savigny got into the French National Library, which had the greatest collection of German sources, because wherever Napoleon marched, he simply looted the libraries. And Savigny got more than he could handle, so he invited favorite grad student Jacob Grimm to come help him with his research. And for a year, probably the best year of Jacob Grimm's life, he was 20 years old, he dived into the sources of the German Middle Ages. In 1806, he got an emergency letter from his brother, Willem. Come home quickly, the French have occupied the country, mother is near death, I'm too sick to work, so come back. And he went back to the bitterest years of German history, when the very existence of any Germany seemed in doubt. And then what came out of their work was what came out of their work from 1806 to 1812 in these worst years was a sense that Jacob Grimm mastered German literature. Willem Grimm went into Old Norse mythology, the ancient Scandinavian mythology, and they discovered that many motifs and characters of the German stuff had come out of ancient Scandinavian mythology. They had found a dignified past for Germany. And the first and frankly the sloppiest piece of their academic research came on December 25th, 1812, with the publication of 50, in the original version, 50 stories, Kinder- und Hausmärchen. Children and household traditional tales would be the regular translation. Their overall project was to discover this form-giving period. I frankly don't believe there ever was this pure Germanic culture in the past. But their project is to discover that pure German culture of 2,500 years before their time. If they can just discover that culture, they can revive it and make Germany proud and strong in their day. And to this end, they work 15 hours a day for 60 years on this project and do some really amazing things. They try, once they run out of written sources, which is very early, they try a model of cultural breakdown. This is not their name, but it's my name for what they do. They see a process like this. There once was a culture that had its own religion, we call Old Norse mythology, Old Norse religion. It had its own language, the original Germanic language. It had its own culture, its own wedding ways, its own dress customs. A culture tends to pull together with gravity. There was once a culture called Germanic, and you will use for this as a shorthand, Old Norse religion. And over time, the culture broke up. Either pressure from the Mediterranean world or cultures just break up. And as the religion was no longer believed, the great mythology broke up into epics, 6 or 8 great epics. And over 200 or 300 years later, the epics broke up into legends. And 200 or 300 years later, the legends broke up into folk tales. The folk tales themselves later got summed up into proverbs. The proverbs were summed up by riddles. And the final level of cultural decay is simple words, popular customs, gestures, these sorts of things. So they've got this pattern of cultural decay, cultural breakup. And the way they see it, as they stand in their present, they are in the middle of a 2 billion piece jigsaw puzzle of the old culture. If they can just put the puzzle back together, they can make Germany free and strong in their own day. For example, to illustrate this model of culture breakdown, in the old religion there's a figure called Valkyrie, literally a maiden of the slain. These are nameless, faceless daughters of Odin, and their job is to fly down to earth to battlefields, and any human hero killed on a battlefield, they will take the soul of that human hero back to Valhalla, Hall of the Slain, and there, for the rest of the time, these heroes will fight and practice war. And finally, in the last days, when all the forces of evil come out against the gods, from 800 doors come 539 of the greatest human heroes to fight with the gods, their creators, in their hour of need. It's the meaning of it all from the German religion. And so from that Valkyrie figure, from the epic and the religion, you come down to the Siegfried tale of the Siegfried legend, the great Siegfried legend of the German Middle Ages, probably the most important of these legends. And you have the story of Siegfried and Brunhild, or Brunhilde. Brunhild is the favorite daughter of Odin. She has a name, she has a face. Flying down to earth one day to get the soul of a hero, she spies Siegfried, most handsome and bravest of mortal men. She falls hopelessly in love with Siegfried. Her father, like any father whose daughter falls in love beneath her station, locks her in a room, more or less, puts her on a magic mountain surrounded by fire. And she asks him one favor before she goes under. Father, allow me to be rescued from the fire by the bravest of mortal men, that I might live as a mortal woman by his side till we die. And the father, Odin, has to relent and give her that particular wish. And then you come down to folk tales collected by the Grimms, like Sleeping Beauty, which is known, I suppose, now all over the world. Sleeping Beauty is not named Brunhild. The Handsome Prince is not named Siegfried, not named at all, but it's manifestly descended from the medieval legend. So this is the sort of pattern of breakdown that they're working with. They're not collecting folk tales for children. They're collecting folk tales because they have bits and pieces of the old religion. Willem Grimm was the more poetic of the two. He called it pieces of the splintered jewel, pieces, little fragments of that ancient religion. He says that they inform the fairy tales, they give them their feeling of something magical and otherworldly. This particular... Then comes the development of philology. About the time the Grimms were born, the British discovered, quote-unquote, Sanskrit in their occupation of India. Sanskrit had been there all the time, but British scholars found it and are fascinated by parallels between Sanskrit and European languages. And the Grimms are in on that second generation of Sanskrit study. Jacob Grimm will, in his work to do the history in words, he will learn 70 languages, living and dead. He has a working knowledge of 70 languages, which always impressed me. He's the giant of all philologists. And so they're working out these, as they work out the parallels with language, that more and more they're finding cultural parallels between the ancient Sanskrit speakers and European speakers. And in 1813, within half a year of the publication of Grimm's fairy tales, the academic world renames European languages Indo-European languages. Jacob Grimm is such a famous philologist. He works out a still celebrated theory of the consonant shift. If you plot the Indo-European world on sort of a British Isles to India grid, and you lots of aspirated consonants that begin words evolve into unaspirated, like T to D, To in English is softened to V in Dutch, is softened further in German to zwei, and then you get into the Persian and the Romance and the Slavic and the Sanskrit worlds becomes do and dva and dvie, so the T becomes a D. He is such a great philologist. He can reinvent long dead languages. By 600 or so, the German tribes had moved into Italy. The Gothic tribes had moved into northern Italy, picked up Italian and gave up Gothic. With a few fragments of Gothic, and knowing where Gothic was, the easternmost of the German languages, he does a grammar and a dictionary of Gothic. He even does a grammar and dictionary of Proto-Indo-European, the original Indo-European, by looking at the fringes of the world. Something I guess you can't prove until we have a time machine, is right or wrong. Among their mature works, dwarfing and at the same time complementing the fairy tales, are the history of the German language, and then the greatest dictionary of its day, the Grimm's Dictionary of the German Language. Not finished by them, but completely outlined by them, a model for the Oxford English Dictionary, and that is done on historical principles. There's a little bit of history in every word. We don't know all those histories, but the Grimms are going to use those histories as bits and pieces to reconstruct this whole thing. Their masterwork is a 4-volume work called, in English it's mistranslated, Teutonic Mythology. It should be translated Deutsche Mythology, Germanic Mythology. Jakob Grimm says, I would like to set forth all that can be now known of German heathenism, by which he means the ancient culture 2,500 years ago. And he has a chapter on the idea of God. He has a chapter on every major god and goddess. He has chapters on charm and trees and elves and wights and what these people thought about this. He uses those 70 languages at his disposal. Most people can't read every other page because he's quoting from these languages. But then he sums it up. And at the end of this magnificent book, any German who read that would be convinced of the antiquity and vibrancy of German culture. And that would be used in politics. That would be used in art and in literature and in music and in politics as the motive force for German nationalism that put the whole country together. Case in point is the famous German composer Richard Wagner of the 19th century. Known for his mature operas from 1844 until 1874. In 1843, the year before he was born in 1813, so he was 30 years old. In 1843, he was a rather depressed 30-year-old, his music not being recognized. And he took refuge at a spa, and he said later, I had Jakob Grimm's Teutonic Mythology with me. And he read Teutonic Mythology and had what amounted to a religious conversion to this new folkish nationalism. Let me read you just the last part of this. Yet I was firmly in the power of its strange enchantment. Even the most fragmentary legend spoke to me in a profoundly familiar tongue, and soon my entire sensibility was possessed by images suggesting ever more clearly the recapture of a long-lost yet eagerly sought consciousness. There rose up in my soul a whole world of figures which proved so unexpectedly solid and well-known that I saw them clearly before me and heard their speech. The effect they produced on my innermost being I can only describe as a complete rebirth, just as we feel tender joy at a child's first sudden flash of recognition. So now my own eyes, flashed with rapture at a world I saw revealed for the first time as if by miracle, in which I had previously moved blindly, though presentient, like a child in its mother's womb. Soul, rebirth, joy, rapture, revelation, miracle. Wagner went to the language of religious conversion to describe his reading of Grimm. And then began his great mature operas, every one based on Germanic legend, every one researched in the scholarly work of the Brothers Grimm. This is, in terms of political history, this is as invisible as steam, but it runs the motor manipulated by great politicians like Bismarck to create a German nation. And that was the model for all those European peoples as of 1800 who those language groups who did not have their own state. That's sort of the model that they all went by. There's a pattern to that if you go through these in Europe and to a certain extent the rest of the world, there's a pattern that repeats over and over. An educational movement had to at least try to reteach this to the young people and the young adults of the society. The second major development was literary recovery and, to a certain extent, literary creation. And it closely followed the language revival. Collection of folktales and legends were a universal feature of this phase, but it also paid particular attention to the epic. In the 19th century in Europe, if you had an epic, you deserved a state. It was simply a matter of status. And so if you had an epic, like Germany or England with the Nibelungenlied and Beowulf, you dusted it off. If you had pieces of an epic, you scissored and pasted them together, like Finland's Kalevala. If you didn't have an epic, you faked it. You forged an epic, like the Ossianic poems, or we'll talk about the Czech example in a few minutes. So you have the second phase then is literary recovery. The third phase is music revival and creation, and it usually parallels that of literature. The folk songs and dances had to be researched and popularized, and while you're out there collecting the folk tales and the epics, you might as well collect the folk dance. Then sophisticated composers had to do two things to the admiration of their countrymen and the world. Use folk musical idiom, melodies, rhythms, instrumentation as a mine for modern sophisticated works, and create musical tone poems around images or a feeling for a nation's land or history. A fourth fairly clear category is history recovery, or at least recreation. Someone from your folk, from your language group, had to write the history of your country. Your history had been written, but by those folks who owned you, by those folks who didn't think much of your culture. So you had to write your own history. A fifth development is a cult of physical fitness, usually motivated and justified by a war that is looming against the oppressors. For example, in Ireland, Michael Cusick started the Gaelic Athletic Association to use traditional Irish games, as opposed to those, as he said, limp-wristed British games like badminton and lawn tennis. And then you had an underground group that was fed by that sports, the Gaelic Athletic Association fed its members into the IRA and the IRB, the underground guerrilla movement against the British. How are we doing for time, Kaylin? Okay. Let me take one European folk group and just kind of hit the high points along this line. This is a group that has it was proudly there, at least an embryo in mind in the 19th century. It became an independent state in 1918. It was destroyed by the Nazis and then the Soviets, and reborn at the end of the Soviet Union, and then it simply evaporated. There's a book called Imagined Communities, describing to a certain extent your patriotism is an unconscious decision instead of a natural thing. But this is the Czechoslovak group. When I was growing up and I was young, there were millions of Czechoslovaks. Now there are no Czechoslovaks. There are Czechs and there are Slovaks and possibly Moravians, but none left. But here's the process, and see if you recognize the pattern. Joseph Dabrowski died 1829. Was a Jesuit-trained Czech, a superb linguist. He wrote a Czech grammar. He had to harmonize a grammar from dialects. He wrote a Czech grammar and then a history of the Czech language in 1818. He wrote it in German because there was no Czech to use. Joseph Jungmann died in 1847, was a tireless translator of great works into Dabrowski's New Czech, beginning with Paradise Lost in 1811. In 1825, he finished his massive history of Czech literature based on extensive manuscript research written in this new and improved Czech language of Dabrowski. In his last 40 years of life, he worked at a Czech dictionary that ran to 4,500 pages. So together, Dabrowski and Jungmann regenerated the language, and after that came literature. As early as 1821, they could already see the future in three young friends, Kolar, Shafarek, and Palatsky. Jan Kolar, died 1852, was the first good poet of the Czech language revival, even though he was Slovak. He wrote a sort of epic of sonnets, a love story on the surface, but a longing for independence beneath. The hero of the epic wandered along rivers that were once Slavic, but then dominated by other people. For 30 years, he pastored a Slovak church in Budapest and resented the Hungarian overlordship. Shafarek was also Slovak. He wrote on Slavic language and literature, came to Prague by 1830, published a book on Slavic antiquities, which was sort of a cultural history of all the Slavs. František Palatsky was the first really good historian of the Czechs, and his work in history led him directly into politics. He was involved in the revolutions of 1848 when the Czechs first started to try to set up a state. And here is what one historian wrote about this historian, this Czechoslovak historian. In the setting of an enslaved nation, a long-neglected language, a hostile church, and a denationalized middle class, he brought them back to life. He gave them courage and belief in a forgotten or despised past, and proved to them they had achievements in the moral and intellectual sphere of which any nation might be proud. At the time, a fourth great writer had fame among them, and then Václav Hanka. And Hanka had discovered Europe's oldest epic in the attic of a castle in northern Bohemia. And it was excitedly published. And then, wonder to behold, he found another epic in southern Bohemia. Even his friends became suspicious at this point. He was a great writer. He totally fabricated these epics. But for a while, young Czechs flocked to his banner. And even though they were forgeries later, many people came to the national movement who didn't leave later. Then came the musicians and the writers. Smetana, a composer, was on in the fighting in 1848 and composed a revolution. By 1870s, he's composed a Mavlas, My Fatherland, talking about a Czech fatherland in a German and Austrian-occupied world. His tone poem, ironic about the river that goes through Prague, and describes a visual image of is known today, ironically, more by its German name, the Moldau, than by its Czech name, Mavlas. But here, and then you have by 1862, you have a group called the Sokols, the Falcons. This is a physical fitness group. By World War I, they are doing physical fitness, difficult things, 15,000 strong in unison. And they will be an important part of the soldiery that helps Czechoslovakia win independence in 1918. Folk tales, from toddlers to elementary school children to adults, were a celebrated part of virtually every case of modern cultural nationalism. And I think it's mostly a good thing, but there are some worrisome things in it too. Herder, for example, to start back at the beginning, Herder was amazingly positive about almost every group in humanity. But Jews, for example, he was viciously anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. He thought Jews were a culture that had outlived their natural lifespan and were living by being parasites on other cultures. Once you read Herder on Jews, later German treatment of Jews will be no great surprise. Wagner, this great composer, had a dark side. Wagner was caught up in the neo-scientific racism of the 19th century. He dedicated works to Comte de Gobineau, the author of the essay on inequality of the races. Even in the Grimms, when you read the very last thing Jakob Grimm writes, he says this in his autobiography: "Nearly all my labors have been devoted, either directly or indirectly, to the investigation of our earlier language, poetry, and laws. These studies may have appeared to many, and may still appear useless. To me, they've always seemed a noble and earnest task, definitely and inseparably connected with our common fatherland and calculated to foster love of it. So even in the Drems, a bit of an extreme patriotism. But this emotion is a source of a lot of European power. You have a Britain forged of Welsh, Irish, English, Scots, so unified that when it takes on an India, for example, it's no contest because of that new sort of patriotism. You have you will have a British occupation of South Africa that's almost effortless, and they bring with them this particular supranationalism, this particular cultural nationalism, and then you watch it spread to the rest of the world. You watch, for example, Afrikaners. The Boers of the 19th century become the Afrikaners of the 20th. They begin to say Afrikaans is not a dialect of Dutch. Afrikaans is a separate language. We have our own traditions. We should be our own country. Russian Jews will, in reaction to European persecution after 1881, will go to Palestine and create a white-hot nationalism, generally called Zionism. And then these have their further reactions. For example, when Nelson Mandela was a young man, his mentor, Anton Lembede, who died young, so you don't hear much about him later, Anton Lembede said, nationalism is the most important movement of modern times. It is the only antidote to foreign imperialism and colonialism. Nationalism is the only antidote to foreign imperialism and colonialism. He had grown up in the Orange Free State, the most racist part, I guess, of South Africa, and he had seen that Afrikaner nationalism. He wanted it for Africans. You can see that pattern happening all over the world. There had to be an overall positive value in preserving for the whole people what just a few people in the countryside held in their memories. And there had to be positive benefits in terms of social integration and respect from introducing illiterate and semi-literate people to the proudly literate heights of society. To say, you bearers of oral culture, you are valuable. And perhaps it's as simple as this, trying to talk about good and bad in this whole international pattern. To the extent that folktale collection and cultural nationalism generally has enriched the lives of a whole linguistic group and inspired them with meaning in their current lives, it's been good. Whenever it has caused a lack of sympathy for ethnic minorities at home or jingoistic foreign policies, it's been bad. Wherever uniqueness is identified as superiority, a dangerous ethical boundary has been crossed. Thanks, I appreciate it.
대대년과 맥도베 유기비 센터 기고베 나베주 십주대와루 중앙체 뱅게 가자법 범메세 용기 로테지 나치다 람세이 배치지도 이제 함노 뉴토도 남기 샤기자 부서도 특혜비 대가이 남샤군마와 남제기 징기라비베이 어치제지를 제도 토로 잠자니지 콘디 나지게 개비 감지나 밤잠비람다 리세도 답된데 걸리지 미디 유모 부지 대제이 된데스간지 감미지 배주십지대 자기 나페주십지대와기 내다긴데 사간래 양차치위 때 가서 유버콘도 예버세 어체 뺀지 깔로블레 제합도 기타블루 세다 등길람 대세 엄마잠비 감지나 랍자세기 티버스 모미시 도미 된데스단제 탑되기 제합야제 돈에도 bombesedio 기능이 주모 센터주되기 파시불로 되미디 제가 기pen점이 기로 배주십지대와 가든지 담배라 주민요 공도배 마다게 고치셔베된 바남디 기존의 밀럼쇼 세미기 때문에 신주도 둘집디 양아처럼 배주십지대오기 대성이 잘라 제놈이 까지로 솔로도 자마다기 가랭아기 나 손으로 자모속도 선배도 좀더 봄담 주제미기 고래 배송 돈이 있으시니 내가 선배도 좀 세미기 때문에 걸어 중국어로 전에 선배도 좀 세미 따고면데 때 걸어 손잡기 맨디버를 때 방견진일로 때 알로 부지기는 거다. 부지기기 때문에 남기는 서진 도동배세장알로기. 주로 샤우치 기울라 아파트 때 부기기 때문에 지세 가다비슈기 더울라다기 때 다와 정보 세타자. 다들 밤조바 dem절로 맞으리냐 뭐지 람스가 놀로에 때 안에 알루기 기가다네 보모 안에 기가다 요갑로 때 거기 때 자카츠도 디스트릭트기 기가다오돌로 거기 기원이 뭐지리지 기랍데 성페노 부정비기 지고 기원 임베스기 때 딱선 중일에 코충국을로 거기로 셋네 성페도 좀 세슈노 세슈 다들 성페도 좀비기 가데베이서 진 때 콜로 접제성수 범위기 지지 범법의 소유실로 때 콜로 접제대 지주걸레 범대들로 나기 예루미로 보코피도 지로베네디기 때 콜로다 년지적 때 지나 파시 승모바 때 콜로 남지 범기 갈라 축조바데미기 차로 간다지 때남 범지세베 기나 남주 비잔 벌라 때 남들 tukjabi 때 남들 밤에지 셈더tin 고개 밤에 셈마세버 tukjabi 거러 교환이 뭐 상비기 리지치 배울랬던지 거러 교환님이 바차색들이 만내베데 보면 또 나기 손자 접해서 잡아지니 주차차 침날에 밤에기 때 육자데 줄레타 때 따지 müdürbezo betendelek sondir reji pülücü pülelokta jalücü jalelokta pülücü te kogi longochuni chusuchi te kola songro sudedon te kogi sanjap deti bere te ko amchudige kennalu ninjap jenedege remgi te alu tude je tensunu pusipam maluju te gato to kiton to vedene ire kogi son longochuni de 지기는 걸로 처음에 계좌를 때 거기 성기 저월남도도 주마도 받고 공부해 왔습니다. 그들로 걸어서 시와 가다면 있는 아 기운님하고는 성필 노부 성비기 교원이 있어있네. 성필 노부 성부 선배님 노부지 성잡이네. 당하게 성잡들이 말로 저월남도도 살에 주마도 같이 집이 괜지 있나. 단도와도 내값이 성대 사실 jak신다. 기나 암수 붙이기 자로 비비되 버진 가니네 총합쳐 잡아진 까몽 기나로 때주 파마 두두비 죽자데 저에도 암수도 붙어 또블루니기냐 가두 세노 코레셈기 코 삼주비비 자도는 거라 기나로 때내려냐 소베되는 이루 코라 총자 반대비 주도기 저 거리기 신데 딱 포스인이 되겠지 매장안에 까지 대지지 폼포베 때따데 소베데들로 님질로 때코마 빵탄으로 따서서 숨배 따따서 숨배신도 따데 폰나라 파통하자 취요지에서로 거러게 때 취제 통 때려요데 한글로니 다 베짐데들로 사람 죽을 안에 주요대 바카지네게 던 심지 조모치기 야적처럼 마피 고개 내게 딱 십비티 짐들어졌던 조모되게 야렌서 게지 말렌서 게 법리야스 그 구세고라 조모되게 싸대 고타갈라 게요 주요대 바카게야스 텔라 kho야테 캬바치 베네니게 고개 딱지게 돌고 와 심지기 텔레 송소도 저소도 조모이사기 고개 내가 예수 수바신데도 나도 같이 배상하고 난 미치 그 뒤사시 포르 사치 선수비 뒤지고 나 손으로 지니 세터 건너서 또 도로 손으로 지내기 잘라지노 내가 콜로 로테지 조모지 때는 봐 내가 그 손으로 지내 잘라지고 걸래 댐치기 나로 때pengi 나로 콜로 같이 본다 같이 모셔 가진 와 선배도 오자면 수세라 내가 코pengi 군대 자유 걸래 지 처음 맞잡이 선배님이 가져서도 내가 계속 놀래 대기와냐 먹어 선배는 무슨 기와이네 근데서 쇼도를 뺀 야, 내가 이 마침 선배는 무슨 노비게 손잡지 미치 지나 땅에 반하고 내가 되는데 다 저런 말 사회적 소리로서 노도지 팔았으면 된 맛이 맞아 뺀지가 너무 텔럼 코로 도비는 가다베는 가인 구인 마실집에 대pen지 분들에 라소서 청어수베 때마이 텐수노 때 거리기 차로 좀또또 찍게 자지 찍게다 때또 찍들로 대잡수들 랍노와 다르벤 대pen지 나랑아네베 대장 소리는 노도지 팔라지 때소세이메스 나긴 노대좀 간치요가 가tem치요가 때 쿵도 개바 같이 있는 내 때마 주도로 같이 배고 말로 같이 주도 참이 미시스 이를 딱 얘기 잡주디 주기 배되게 안에 주내기 될로 탑도 내가 대저 같이로 땡고비를 얘기 잡주디 주기 배는 세터 서치들로 다또 서치들로 랍도 세터 서치게 와 마지기 주기 말로 남는데 레짐치네 이로 높세면데 라발레마 잠던 터지 매 폴로테 값이 지고 위해서 유의했을 때 폴로 쿵도 개바 bombe 이래 다 다른하기 싫어도 탑 돈받치 때인게 했어요 다또 탑 돈받에 가대비 있나서 무슨 다리 저라 신나 주의사랑 신나 주신나 암수동 걸로 저지다 이거 지로 마사와디 했어요 다들 때 암수기 쉬어 같이 배도 마사 좋아진 때가 뺑기날에 다리 좀 설리는 녹도지 팔람 때문에 지내기 때가 드시스 대보다로 나기 진노로 타고도 녹도지 팔람네 때내기 미들로 론테도 계속 가지고 뭐 서와신 암수치기 포자 캐칭나 세세기 먹지고서 인베스 chen 얘기 부집하면 마실에게 미 당마시 솔루트니 인베스 저러 저스다 앞세 도서집들이 걸로 때내고 된다. 다들 내도 그러야 다리 코지나 같이 지때미나 가이 이런 거 파다지 랍다그노. 대신나 해실래 때 그래 아무튼 동칼리 먹을 때네 저스톱들 대동 같이게로 잘 맞은 총게로 총에 맞은 또게로 또에 삼아도 봐줘도 돼. 내가 거기 암치기 걸로라면 왜 다리 치 같이 배도 못 양 뺑기는 가지고 주시죠 맨나스 양 저를 zul만 되고 맨나스 너서 포셔 맨나스 시스템도 중에 같이 포셔 뭐 제도 많이도 도이 저런 마성망 알로 통하들라 저기 같이 배고비로 가기 베게 셀럽노 때들라 때 소배도 zambur기 또 거래 암줄로 안에 집하게 랍도